first question. What do you think of the ITT Hub?
I think it's terrific. And I think, there's been a gap in the market, I think, for this kind of innovation and technology theme, if that's the right way of putting it. And I think everything that's going on in the transport world, particularly with EV and net zero and all those kind of broader government agendas, and of course COP26, now is the perfect time for an event like this. And the level of interest, I think, is fantastic. And I think it shows that there's a lot of innovation going on within the industry and, not before time.
What do you make of, we've got innovation on the one side, obviously debate, and then some would say government inertia in terms of moving forward with a lack of policy, a lack of regulation, and a lack of incentives in the commercial market?
Yeah, I think that's probably a difficult situation for both sides of that equation. It's one of the reasons, of course, why we're hosting a seminar on that very issue about what government needs to do to help the private sector achieve net zero. And I think, to be fair to all sides, really, I think this is such an evolving sector, if that's the right way of putting it, or an evolving issue, that everybody's still learning. And I suspect that actually the government probably isn't as aware of some of the challenges that the private sector face, and the private sector is probably a bit impatient with the government to kind of get on and clarify both the policy agenda, the levels of funding that the government's prepared to put in, and indeed the longevity and stability of that kind of funding. So I think both sides are learning. So I'm not surprised if occasionally there seems to be a bit of disconnect between the private sector on the one side and the government on the other. And certainly I don't envy the government and the DfT at all, because this is a big agenda, and we're still at the early stages of a very large learning curve.
And you talk about challenges. What do you see as the biggest challenges, both for the OEMs and the operators themselves who want to buy this product?
Yeah, I suspect. I'm no technician when it comes to this kind of issue, but I suspect the challenge, the biggest challenge for both sides, is actually funding stability. That's really what I think the private sector needs in terms of where it needs government support in subsidy terms, and just making sure that funding stream is both long-term and stable, and also that the policy landscape is stable as well. That I think there have been various changes in terms of government support for conversion to electric vehicles, for example, car vehicles. And I think that can sometimes destabilize the private sector. So it's, I think that whenever I've spoken to the private sector companies, the one theme that they keep on coming up with is stability and certainty. And that's not always something the government is either capable of doing or indeed able to do.
Are there enough incentives, though, for the commercial market to develop on the EV side of things?
I think so. As I say, I think it's just a question of making sure that the incentives that are there aren't short-term or withdrawn, at short notice by the Treasury. That's the issue. And I think, I can't remember the details, but quite recently, the Treasury reduced the grants available for people to convert to electric vehicles. That came quite quickly, and it surprised and destabilized the market. So I think that's, again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think that's the area that the government really needs to focus on.
And we've waited for the decarbonisation white paper, which clearly is going to push things much further forward in all fields, not just transport. But, the government doesn't seem to be publishing this document, and everyone's waiting for it.
And I think that's a very good practical example of where the private sector and innovators in this sector, need the government to kind of keep to its commitments. So, I think the DfT and ministers have been promising us this transport decarbonisation plan for 6-9 months or more, and every time a minister is asked when's it going to come out, the answer is soon, and the next time they're asked, it's still soon. And that was true also, just veering off into a different sector. It was true with the rail white paper. And I think that's where the government has to try and as best it can to be much more consistent with itself. And when it says it's going to publish something, it does so. And my worry there really is, why are these papers delayed? I suspect it's because there are tensions within government over the content of them, not least between the DfT obviously and the Treasury, and that just doesn't help confidence.
What about hydrogen? A lot of talk about EV technology for commercial vehicles, but many say hydrogen is the great white hope. Hydrogen's the sort of panacea.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I'm not a technical guy, but everybody I've heard speak about it say yes, hydrogen will have its day, but it's a long way down the road. It's not properly developed yet as an alternative source of fuel. Certainly to kind of convert in any major way to non-diesel. And everybody is saying that if the government wants to achieve its net zero targets by the deadlines that it's setting, then battery is the much more reliable and proven technology today. That's not to say that hydrogen won't catch up, but I think as ever with these things, it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think both have to kind of develop in tandem with each other. So, there are those in the hydrogen lobby who say it is absolutely the future. There are those in the battery lobby who say, well, it's not proven. So I think both sides just have to get on with it. I don't think there is a one solution to this issue.
And what about infrastructure? Clearly, take the example of cars and vans, there is an infrastructure that's slowly being put in, but do we need the same kind of infrastructure for commercial vehicles, or do we need subsidies for installing fast chargers within depots or hubs where commercial vehicles can go to perhaps fill up with all alternative fuels?
Well, I think the real issue there is certainly I think there needs to be much more investment in electric charging. That seems to be a consensus kind of across the industry, and that's just not coming on stream fast enough. So yes, there has to be more investment in that kind of infrastructure. I think that the issue for me is I think there are two things. One, where will technology take us in terms of the use of drones and things like that? I'm not sure anybody really knows the answer for that. And I think the other big issue, which will have, I think, an impact on certainly the road infrastructure and the capacity of the network and all that kind of thing, is the government prepared to bite the bullet on road pricing? And I think it's going to have to, and I think the government knows it's going to have to, but no Secretary of State for Transport wants to be in the hot seat when that particular parcel lands in his lap and the moment comes. But I think infrastructure, particularly on electric charging points, is clearly absolutely critical, because without that it's just not going to work. And it may be that local authorities and government are going to have to put their hands in their pocket much more than they are at the moment. And certainly when you talk to the bus industry, the government is now consulting on a date to stop the manufacture of diesel-only buses. Everybody says that is a much more complicated issue, converting bus depots and all of that over to electric charging. It's a complicated issue. So in terms of infrastructure, yes, there's going to have to be a lot of work done.
Some are concerned the government's sort of sitting on the fence on this issue, bearing in mind they know full well that they're going to have to spend a lot of money to kickstart this industry.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think the bus sector is actually a very good example of that, because a lot of the depots are Victorian, and they weren't built for electric charging, and I think the real problem the industry has, and the government won't like me for saying this, but the reality is that the amount of money that it's prepared to put into the bus industry to deliver the aspirations of the National Bus Strategy is woefully inadequate. And there is nobody on any side of the debate, whether you're a local authority or a bus operator, who will say anything other than that. I mean, £3 billion to deliver the aspiration of the bus strategy, and that's £3 million only in the life of this Parliament, across 80 plus local transport authorities and combined authorities. You don't need to be a mathematician to work out that that's not very much per authority. And the money, the funding there is just not enough. And the Treasury is going to have to, it's got a wake-up call coming. And I'm sure officials in both the Treasury and the DFT know this, but of course, the DFT is hamstrung by what it's got.
Do you worry that with all these spending priorities and money going out of the Treasury as a result of COVID, that we might not see the level of investment that we need, or at least we might not see the level of investment we need as soon as it would have been had it not been for COVID?
Well, I think you're touching there on an issue around, what are the right priorities when it comes to spending for the DFT. And I mean, you're never going to please everybody all the time on that issue. I mean, self-evidently. But I think in the current environment, if I was asked where has the government got their spending priorities wrong on transport, then I would definitely have to say, and I won't be liked by many people for saying this, but I would have to say HS2 is a questionable priority given the environment we're now in. I mean, its costs continue to balloon, so I hear. So 100 billion today, well, by the time it's built, let's say that's going to be 150 to 200 billion. I mean, you can do an awful lot with that money elsewhere in the transport sector. I think that would be my number one question mark for the DFT. And yeah, I mean, there are lots of local authorities up north who are crying out for it, and Boris Johnson and Grant Shapps have a difficult, and Rishi Sunak have a difficult decision to take when they come to finally announce their views on the National Infrastructure Commission's report. Not an easy one, but £100 billion for a railway when we don't really know what the future of travel is going to look like in 50 years' time when it's opened.
And just one question about the bus industry generally. It's clear the bus industry was on its knees as a result of COVID, like the rail industry. Do you think the government missed a trick in terms of perhaps going back to some pre-1985 legislation that might have helped move things forward and give a better deal for passengers?
Well, I think a lot of the people in the bus industry would say that that's exactly what it's done with its national bus strategy. I think you can argue that the bus strategy brings the curtain down on bus deregulation because the local transport authorities now have to produce their bus improvement plans. They have to decide whether they go down a franchising route or an enhanced partnership route, which is a halfway house towards franchising, you could argue. And they all have to decide that by close of play today. And I think, if someone in the bus industry was asked the question and was honest, they would say that bus deregulation has effectively been brought to a close because the bus operators are no longer masters of their own destiny. So I think I think that's exactly what the government has done.
So where do you think we're heading? I mean, crystal ball gazing, what do you think we're heading for in terms of EV, how things are going to develop, legislation, infrastructure? What's your best guess?
Gosh, I wish I could have a crystal ball. I mean, to be perfectly honest, if I'm absolutely honest about that, I don't really know. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I think the debates around things like hydrogen and battery are sometimes potentially leading us down a garden path, because both will work in the end. If I was asked what the future would look like, well, I mean, clearly come 2040, the vast majority of cars will be electric cars. The infrastructure to support that will be much bigger and more obvious. I think our travel patterns will probably be different. Our working behaviours will be different. Our leisure patterns will be different, and all of that's going to impact on the transport industry. Yeah. And to be absolutely honest, and I think this is one of the reasons why policymakers have such a difficult task, I don't think anybody can look beyond the next 5 years, to be perfectly honest. And we just don't know what the future will look like. So I think I'm going to slightly dodge the question, actually, because I think if I was to say what I thought it would look like, I'm almost certainly going to be wrong, and I just don't know.
I don't blame you. Steve Bramall, many thanks.
Pleasure.